the time, it was the worst crash in aviation history.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation.
In 1974, more than 300 people died when their plane fell from the sky.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
You couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being.
The key to understanding the disaster is found thousands of kilometers away. An unusual piece of evidence that tells the troubling story of a crash that could have been prevented.
Mayday, Mayday.
June the 12th, 1972. One of the newest members of American Airlines fleet is in Detroit, Michigan.
John, Paige.
Flight 96, a brand new DC-10, is getting ready for takeoff. Captain Bryce McCormick and co-pilot Paige Whitney have been in the plane for hours.
Back there, so when we're in flight, if you can get a chance just to look at that.
Detroit is just a stopover on a flight from LA to Buffalo and then to New York.
You got there? You ready to try one, Paige?
All right, sir.
McCormick has flown the plane out from California, but Whitney is going to fly the next leg. Both men want as much time at the controls as possible. Neither one of them has more than 75 hours flying the DC-10. Few pilots have more. There simply aren't enough of the planes in the air. In 1972, the DC-10 had just been introduced. The plane is the latest advance to passenger jets. Its style and its size set it apart from other airliners. The McDonnell Douglas Corporation has spent more than $1 billion developing it.
In the late 60s, there was a race going among the three major manufacturers of jetliners, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, and Lockheed, to see who could get the first jumbo out. So they got really busy on getting this DC-10 into production as fast as they could. And one of the things that they could not suffer were many delays based on some problem with the design.
American Airlines is one of the first companies to buy the plane. Flight 96 is one of those planes. Just the fifth DC-10 ever built. Cydia Smith has just been trained to be the chief flight attendant on the DC-10.
I was excited because it was one of the first jumbos that we had. And I was going to have the opportunity to fly number one, which is what I always wanted to do on a big jet.
Okay, you got it? Hand on the wheel. I got you. V1, rotate.
Just after 7 in the evening, Flight 96 lifts off from Detroit Airport. Just minutes after takeoff, the plane is rising easily through 3,500 meters over Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
I was sitting in my seat, and the captain had turned off the fasten seatbelt sign, and I was making my way to the galley, and I had to go sort of downhill because we were climbing to go to the galley to turn on the coffee. when I punched the coffee and I moved over to one side, that's when it happened. I remember falling over because the plane was like this, but all of a sudden it just went like this. I saw ceiling compartments fall, and I saw things coming out of pockets and everything, and I thought to myself, oh boy. It felt like the last day of my life.
We hit something! We lost an engine here!
In the cockpit, the crew is fighting for control of their jet. The throttles which control the 3 engines have snapped to idle. The plane loses almost all its thrust. The huge jet begins slowing down.
The plane immediately took a huge drop. And the next thing that happened was I was hit in the face with a piece of the plane. My husband was frantically trying to find a stewardess to give me something to put a pressure on my face to stop the bleeding.
Let me have it!
McCormick takes over control of the plane. He and Whitney wrestle the jet level. But Flight 96 has been badly damaged.
Have we got hydraulics?
No, I've got full rudder here.
The rudder on the tail, which controls the direction of the jet, is jammed to the right. That's forcing the plane to swing dramatically in that direction. While McCormick fights to turn his damaged plane back to Detroit, Cydia Smith is shocked to see a gaping hole in the floor of the main passenger cabin.
People were asking me, what to do, and I knew that I didn't know what to tell them.
Smith has been able to account for all of her passengers. But flight attendant Sandra McConnell is missing.
Sandra! Can you hear me? Sandra, where are you?
And finally, I saw her come out of one of the bathrooms.
McConnell has to cross the hole in the floor to move to safety.
And almost every step she took, the floor kept collapsing.
The crew brings up power to the engines on the wings. But the third engine on the tail stubbornly refuses to respond.
Center, this is American Airlines Flight 96. We got an emergency.
American 96, roger. Type of emergency?
We've got a jammed rudder. We need to get down and make an approach.
Along with his engine and his rudder, McCormick is also having trouble controlling the elevators on the tail of the plane. They help him move the massive plane up and down. They're slow to respond, but he can move them. The situation isn't completely hopeless.
I think it's going to fly!
American 96, turn further right, heading 200.
Without complete control of the elevators, and with a rudder that's frozen to the right, McCormick has to use his engines to turn the plane. By increasing the thrust on one side of the plane, he can change direction. But it won't be fast.
I have no rudder control whatsoever. So our turns are going to have to be very slow and cautious.
All of the passengers move as far away from the hole in the back as possible. But apart from the cut to Loretta Kaminsky, so far there are no other serious injuries.
Captain, there's a hole in the back of the plane.
A hole?
Yes, sir. What do you want us to do?
Get everyone ready for an emergency emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick's DC-10 is badly damaged. The lives of everyone on board now depend entirely on his ability to land a plane that can barely fly. With explosive suddenness, a short flight from Detroit to Buffalo has become the most challenging flight of Captain Bryce McCormick's career. He's down an engine, and he can't move his rudder. As he heads back to Detroit, McCormick begins to slow his plane down so it can land safely. But when he does, his plane begins falling dangerously fast. Ideally, McCormick should be descending at 700 feet a minute. But now he's falling more than twice that fast. 1,600 feet per minute.
What's the sink rate?
Sink rate. 1,600!
At this rate, McCormick will crash well short of the runway. He increases power to his engines to slow his fall.
Sink rate 700.
McCormick has slowed the plane's descent to 700 feet per minute. But to do that, he's had to increase his forward airspeed, which means he'll be landing far faster than usual. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, McCormick talks to the passengers.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
We've had a small problem, but the plane is under control now, and we're heading back to Detroit for an emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick was as calm as if he were welcoming you on the plane.
As the plane nears the airport, flight attendants ask passengers to remove their shoes and any sharp pieces of jewelry.
They had to take off their shoes and glasses. We collected everything in a blanket.
Less than half an hour after leaving, the badly damaged DC-10 struggles back to the Detroit airport.
The few minutes that it took to get back to Detroit were the longest minutes that I will ever remember spending on an airplane, because we were sure that we were not going to survive.
Captain Bryce McCormick now needs to give the jet even more power to push the nose up for landing. His plane is still drifting to the right and traveling fast.
I have no rudder to straighten it out when it hits.
The DC-10 with 67 people aboard roars toward the runway at almost 300 kilometers an hour.
The landing was the most frightening part of the entire flight.
When the plane hits the ground, it begins veering hard to the right.
Once the plane landed, it seemed like we just went on forever. I mean, it was just forever.
One set of landing gear wheels runs off the runway and through the grass. After a harrowing touchdown, the plane eventually comes to a stop just 300 meters from the end of the runway.
Okay. Engines off at your discretion.
Shut him down.
Every woman wanted to hug him, and he was just amazing, because it was just at that moment that we all realized that we were alive because of him, that he literally had saved our lives.
If you take a look at something like this and you say, well, there's good flying and there's bad flying, this is beyond good. This is superlative. This is using every instinct you have as an airman and all the capabilities you have to stay calm enough to get the situation assessed.
With the plane on the ground, the crew has its first opportunity to inspect the damage.
The captain and I walked back when everybody was off. We walked back to the back, and we just looked up and saw this hole. And it was just so weird.
There's no indication that the jet hit something as the pilots first thought. What has caused such damage to the airliner?
The hole was so enormous that if anyone had been sitting in the seats that were there, they would have been sucked out immediately. At that point, they still felt it might have been a bomb.
But while the incident had happened with explosive suddenness, no indication of a bomb is found. As investigators begin their work, they discover that not all of the DC-10 is at the Detroit airport. A coffin that the plane was carrying in its cargo hold is discovered 30 kilometers away from the Detroit airport, near Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Investigators also find the plane's rear cargo door.
Doors are not supposed to fall off airplanes, especially since it was a rather new airplane. You would not expect something like that to happen.
When they examine the cargo area of the plane, they discover that the very design of the door makes it a potential weak spot. Most doors on a jet open inward. In fact, the door is slightly larger than the frame it fits into. As the pressure builds inside a jet, this type of plug door is actually forced into the frame of the aircraft. The design makes the door extremely safe. But McDonnell Douglas designed the cargo door on the DC-10 to open outward. That decision was made to increase the amount of storage space on the plane. When it's closed, hooks on the DC-10's door grab hold of a bar on the plane's door frame. To make sure it's closed, baggage handlers push down on a lever, which drives locking pins through the hooks, which hold them in place. When investigators examine the cargo area of the plane, they don't find any structural damage around the door. When they study the locks on the cargo door itself, they find that the latches are not completely closed. And the pins that are supposed to make sure the door is locked are not in their locked position.
When we interrogated the cargo handler that closed the door, it became immediately apparent that he used excessive force to close the door. And in fact, he said he had to use his knee to get the door handle to go flush.
Investigators make a frightening discovery. It's possible to close the lever on the outside of the door, even if the hooks and locking pins are not in the closed position. Paul Eddy is a journalist who investigated the history of the DC-10.
What Windsor showed is that you could actually pull the handle in order to buckle the top fixture so that the handle went home properly, but the locking pins had not gone through the spools.
Engage the lever.
This means that baggage handlers can believe the door is closed when it's not. Not only can the outside lever be closed without the locks being fully engaged, there's no way for the crew of the plane to know. The faulty locking pins will still turn off the warning light, even though they aren't in their proper position. The door was a ticking time bomb. As passenger jets climb, the difference between the pressure inside the plane and the pressure outside the plane grows. If a door isn't properly shut, it will blow out with explosive force. The problem on the American Airlines flight began as the plane passed through 3,500 meters. When the door blew, the coffin in the cargo hold was sucked out. When the air pressure inside the plane was released, anything that wasn't firmly attached was pulled out of the airliner.
It's a really startling thing if you're not expecting it. What you've got is a lot of air stuffed inside this pressure vessel that now wants to get out. And the bigger the airplane is, the more powerful the hurricane of air leaving the airplane is during that period of time.
By itself, explosive decompression does not make a plane unflyable. So why had Captain McCormick experienced such difficulties controlling his jet? Investigators take a closer look at the back of the plane's cabin and learn that the very design of the DC-10 makes it vulnerable. When the cargo door blew off, there was so much pressure on the floor of the cabin that it collapsed into the cargo compartment below. When it did, the floor ripped into some of the plane's critical control systems.
When it collapsed the floor, it took the cables that controlled number 2 engine, and it took most of the cables, or impeded most of the cables, that had to do with the flight controls in the back.
I think it's going to fly!
It left McCormick just enough control to keep his plane level. The remarkable flying of Bryce McCormick had saved the lives of everyone on board Flight 96. But there was a problem with one of the newest and most expensive planes flying over North America.
In the Windsor incident, there was an obvious flaw. And that's where the NTSB said, look, here is really the smoking gun, the ability to close that thing without having all those locks engaged. Let's make sure we change this system right now. Every DC-10 operator needs to know this.
I want everything checked. I want all the bolts checked first.
Chuck Miller is the head of the NTSB's Aviation Safety Bureau.
You have to check all the latches, okay? Every single latch.
It's his responsibility to point out problems with the new DC-10 and propose solutions. He helps write the fixes he thinks McDonnell Douglas needs to make to keep the plane safe.
He was a very, very professional man, and he had his investigators had enormous respect for him. Chuck didn't sit back in the office. Chuck was always on the scene.
For Chuck Miller, fixing the DC-10 is a matter of professional pride. For McDonnell Douglas, the near accident over Windsor has enormous implications. Their billion-dollar gamble came close to tumbling from the sky. If anything else goes wrong, the company itself could be at stake. March the 3rd, 1974. A perfect spring-like day in Paris. It's been almost 2 years since a DC-10 came close to crashing near Windsor, Ontario. Now more than 50 of the new planes are flying around the world. One of them, Plane 29, is owned by Turkish Airlines. Normally, the last leg of this trip from Turkey to England wouldn't be very crowded. But today, the DC-10 is filling up fast. People are squeezing into seats throughout the plane. A strike at a British airline has passengers scrambling for any flight back to London. Wendy Wheel is one of many last-minute additions to the flight. A model, she's returning home after a shoot in Spain.
We'd been married for 18 months, and we were about to start a family. I believe the secret of her success for modeling was not just that she was a very attractive girl and good model material, but she was generally liked by all the photographers because she had such a pleasing, lovely, light personality.
With all the new passengers boarding, the flight is a little behind schedule. And it's not only the crew who are waiting. At the back of the plane is baggage handler Mohammed Mahmoudi. With all the new passengers, he's not sure if there are any more bags to load.
C'est tout. Vous êtes fini. Bien, j'ai l'affaire.
Not expecting any other luggage, Mahmoudi locks the rear cargo door. The DC-10 is set to go. Just after 12:30 in the afternoon, THY Flight 981 lifts off into the skies above Paris. London is less than an hour away.
Race control, this is Tango Hotel Yankee 981. We're at 60, requesting clearance to flight level 230.
Tango Hotel Yankee 981, you are cleared to flight level 230.
981, roger.
As it flies away from the airport, the DC-10 continues to gain altitude. 2,700 meters, 3,000 meters, 3,300 meters. The huge jet shudders and banks to the left.
What happened? The cabin blew out! Are you sure?
Just 16 seconds after the start of the crisis, the crew struggles to save their crippled jet. The nose is pitching down, the plane picking up speed.
Bring it up!
I can't bring it up! She doesn't respond!
Passengers at the back of the plane witness a horrifying scene. 2 rows of seats have simply disappeared. Through a huge hole in the floor, passengers can see the sky over France.
7,000 feet! Hydraulics! We've lost it!
The crew discovers that they have no hydraulic power with which to control the plane. Without it, they can't move their rudder or elevators. Even without its most basic controls, the plane begins to level out. But it's fallen too far.
Looks like we're going to hit the ground! Speed!
The DC-10 is traveling almost 800 kilometers an hour. The flight from Paris to London never even makes it to the English Channel. Just 9 minutes after taking off, Turkish Airways Flight 981 becomes the worst plane crash of all time. In London, the flight is listed as delayed. The news of the crash comes out slowly.
I went to the ticket office kiosk and I asked what has happened to the flight, and instantly the look on the gentleman's face behind the counter told me something was wrong, instantly.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
I looked on the television and I just thought, well, I just hope she's dead, because I just saw the carnage of the forest in Senlis, and it was like looking at a First World War trench movie.
Flight 981, carrying 346 passengers, virtually disintegrates on impact. There are no survivors.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation. And the litter of personal possessions, electric wires, bits of metal, bits of bodies, just strewn everywhere. I mean, you couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being. I still have nightmares about this, even though it's 33 years ago.
Investigators for the French Accident Investigation Bureau are quickly on the scene.
My first job was to evaluate the scope of the wreckage and to begin the first investigation on the spot. At first, I was unable to know what has happened. I was just seeing that a terrible crash has occurred and that it will be a very hard work for the investigators.
Despite the enormous force of the crash, the black boxes, made of 3 layers of hardened steel and insulation, survive. Their contents could provide valuable clues about the crash.
Most of the speculation was that it must have been a bomb, because, you know, you've got a almost brand new, very powerful aeroplane flying in clear blue sky, and it gets to 12,000 feet and falls out of it.
Investigators are called to a field 15 kilometers from the crash site. They find a piece of fuselage and 2 rows of seats from the DC-10. Somehow, they fell free of the airliner before the rest of the plane smashed into the forest. When investigators arrive, the bodies of the passengers who were in the seats have already been removed. When relatives of those who died in the crash arrive in France, they're directed to a small church in the town of Senlis.
One of the saddest sights I've ever seen is in this church. They laid out on tables everything they'd found, you know, clothing, possessions, teddy bears, rings, watches. And then relatives who wanted to were allowed to come and walk around these trestle tables with all this stuff laid out.
They produced a little packet with my wife's wedding ring and rings, engagement ring. It was all pretty battered up, so you can imagine the thoughts that went through my mind.
Since the accident involves an American plane, the NTSB's Chuck Miller joins the investigation. For the second time in 2 years, he's dealing with a problem with the DC-10.
I don't believe that Miller suspected for one moment that the door hadn't been fixed after Windsor.
But it becomes clear that the piece of fuselage found in France is in fact the plane's rear cargo door. It seems like a repeat of the Windsor accident. Miller is left with a haunting question. Why hadn't the problem been fixed?
When he saw the door, of course, saw that it hadn't been done. The fix hadn't been made. And that's when I think his anger became very, very strong indeed.
Miller takes an unusual step. Although the official investigation is just beginning, he gives journalist Paul Eddy an important tip.
I said, have you got any ideas what made the door come off? He said, yeah. If I were you, I'd go and look at a place called Windsor, Ontario.
Hello. I'm Chuck Miller.
Miller shares his suspicions with the French investigators.
Could you please pass these around? These were taken on June 12th, 1972, right after the incident.
We have asked for the report on the Windsor accident, and our American colleagues were also volunteers to give us a lot of details.
Now, we had an American Airlines flight from Detroit to Buffalo have its cargo door blow off.
And he has been very frank and had explained what he was thinking of the Windsor accident.
After all the work done during the American Airlines investigation, had something been overlooked? Was there another problem with McDonnell Douglas's enormous plane? With the information from Chuck Miller, French investigators take a closer look at the plane's cargo door. They make a shocking discovery. There is no new problem. It's just like the American Airlines case all over again. The latches that are supposed to hold the cargo door closed aren't locked. And since 2 rows of seats were sucked out of the DC-10 over Paris, it's clear that the floor on the plane collapsed, just as it had in Windsor.
It looks like we're going to hit the ground!
In fact, when investigators listen to the cockpit voice recorder, they find that the Turkish flight crew had even less control of their plane than the crew of American Airlines Flight 96.
We need to get down and make an approach.
I think it's going to fly!
Over Windsor, Bryce McCormick was able to recover his plane and land it. But in Paris, all the hydraulic systems were destroyed.
We've lost it!
The hydraulic fluid helps crews move the rudder and elevators on the tail. Not being able to control them meant the crew couldn't keep their plane in the sky.
The basic problem was the Paris flight was much heavier in terms of the number of people on board. The floor, when it collapsed with such a tremendous amount of pressure that it literally severed all the cables and control to the back. They had no hope after that point.
You and each of you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about
Shortly after the crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 981, Chuck Miller is back in the United States.
Our first witness this morning is Mr. C.O. Miller, Director of the Bureau of Aviation Safety of the NTSB.
This time, he's facing questions from American senators.
A potentially catastrophic design defect.
A special hearing begins to find out how a problem that was identified in 1972 could bring another plane down 2 years later.
Of course, our understanding up to this time, they all had been.
What you've got to now discover is why wasn't that door fixed? Why would a major, venerable, mighty American corporation deliberately do something like this?
Less than a month after the near crash over Windsor, the NTSB had made 2 very specific recommendations. Miller and his investigators recommended that a change be made to the locking mechanism.
Engage the lever.
They wanted to make sure that it was physically impossible for baggage handlers to close the lever without the locking pins being in place. They also suggested that vents be put into the floors of all DC-10s. This would rapidly allow the pressurized cabin air to equalize without collapsing the floor. But in the 2 years since the accident, neither one of these recommendations was implemented.
There is a fundamental problem at the heart of aviation safety, and has been in the United States for a very long time, and that is that it's the job of the NTSB to discover what's happened and to come up with recommendations as to how to prevent it happening again, but it has absolutely no authority to implement them.
The NTSB does not have regulatory authority. They have to turn to the FAA, as they did, and say, we want these things done. And that's where the system went wrong.
If the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, issues an airworthiness directive, planes are pulled out of service until the proper fix is made. But as serious as the problems on the DC-10 were, no airworthiness directive was ever issued. A so-called gentleman's agreement between the head of the FAA and the head of McDonnell Douglas stopped it from happening.
The gentleman's agreement is the root cause of Paris. There is no question that if an airworthiness directive had been issued, as it should have been after Windsor, Paris would not have happened. It was an entirely avoidable accident.
McDonnell Douglas assured the FAA that it would fix the problem voluntarily. An airworthiness directive would cast a shadow on the still fledgling DC-10.
The last thing in the world you want is for the public or any of the airlines who are going to be operating these airplanes to think, oh, maybe there's some flaws in this bird. And so an airworthiness directive, especially one that requires you to go back and re-engineer something, is a really horrific thought for a manufacturer.
McDonnell Douglas did make changes to the way the cargo door was built. A peephole was cut in the bottom of the door so baggage handlers could see if the locking pins had engaged. Several warning signs were also attached to the plane's door. The company also made other changes to the DC-10. These included increasing the length of the locking pins and attaching a plate to the inside of the door. This plate would make it physically impossible to push down the lever if the door wasn't properly locked. But each of the proposed fixes had its own problem. Many baggage handlers didn't know what the small window in the door was for. And the baggage handler in Paris read and spoke 3 languages, but not English, the only language in which the warning signs were written. The support plate that was supposed to be installed in the door was never attached to the jet that crashed in Paris. Papers confirming the completion of the work are also uncovered. But no matter what the paper trail says, the fix was never made.
Again, the problem is you don't have an independent FAA inspector coming along to look and see it and then put his stamp on it, because it wasn't an airworthiness directive.
In the years following the Turkish Airlines crash, an enormous flurry of lawsuits are filed in California. The tragic story of the DC-10 has one more surprise in store. It's 1974, and an unprecedented series of lawsuits are being filed against McDonnell Douglas. The families of those who died near Paris want someone held responsible.
As time went by, I learned more and more about what actually happened and realized that it was not an accident as we would call an accident. It was totally avoidable. My goal was to expose these people.
In the weeks leading up to the trial, lawyers who are involved in the case have access to the entire history of the DC-10's development. They're not the only ones who pore through the evidence. So does journalist Paul Eddy.
We were determined to get to those documents and that testimony. Somebody gave us a key to the depository where the documents were, and so at night we would go in and then had a huge accumulated pile of documents to go through in order to find out what they've been up to.
Reading through the immense pile of paper, Eddy makes an incredible discovery. A memo written by Don Applegate, the director of product engineering for Convair, the company who'd built the cargo door for McDonnell Douglas.
I think the point when we knew we got them was the Applegate Memorandum that specifically pre-warned this would happen.
The memo is a damning indictment of the cargo doors that were being made for the DC-10 and the lack of venting in the cabin floors. It warns that it's only a matter of time before there's a major disaster involving the doors.
The airplane demonstrated an inherent susceptibility to catastrophic failure when exposed to explosive decompression of the cargo compartment.
The memo, written just weeks after the near disaster in Windsor, recommends that immediate changes be made to the DC-10 cargo door.
You know you've got them. You know you've got them because you know they knew.
During the court case, another chilling find is made. Not only did McDonnell Douglas know about the problem after Windsor, they knew during the development of the DC-10. 4 years before the Paris crash, 2 years before Windsor, the cargo door failed during a pressure test. The company knew there was a problem, but the fundamental design of the door stayed the same.
I could not believe a large corporation, McDonnell Douglas at the time, could do such a thing, could risk our lives, ordinary people's lives, for the sake of money.
Well, in aviation, it's called tombstone technology. In other words, we always have the balance of money. And unfortunately, over the years, it has been true more times than not that we have had to wait until we had enough people die in an accident to say, you know, we really are going to have to spend the money over here.
The Applegate memo and other information that comes out during the court case leads to one of the biggest settlements in the history of aviation. McDonnell Douglas paid over $80 million in damages. After the Paris crash, foolproof changes were finally made to the DC-10 cargo door. And this time, nothing was left to chance. The FAA issued an airworthiness directive that ensured the doors would never again open in mid-air. And it worked. After Paris, there wasn't another serious incident involving the cargo doors on a DC-10. But the plane's history and an intensely competitive industry did have an impact. McDonnell Douglas sold far fewer commercial DC-10s than it had once hoped for.
Most of the pilots that I know who have flown the DC-10 over the years really love the old bird. She's probably a little more clunky than the 747 in terms of her heaviness of flight controls, but it's still a lovely bird to fly.
That's fine, but you can't disassociate either the airplane or the company from the awful reputation that the crash left.
Eventually, McDonnell Douglas itself disappears. The company was bought by Boeing in 1996. In the forest outside Paris, a monument now stands honoring those who were killed on Flight 981. A permanent reminder of one of the most disturbing crashes in the history of aviation.
You never forget. And I've gone on to lead my life for 30-odd years, but I've never forgotten. People to this day think it was an accident, and it wasn't.
In heavy wind and blinding rain, the crew of a passenger jet struggles to land.
Put it down! Put it down!
A terrifying crash landing leads to a desperate fight to survive.
The only thing that matters to me now is to get my daughter Emily and protect her as we blow up.
But we just knew that there were so many passengers in that plane that had not gotten out.
Open the door! Open the door!
Mayday, Mayday.
This is a true story based on air traffic control recordings, official reports, and interviews with those involved. Tuesday, August the 2nd, 2005. Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. 297 passengers are boarding Air France Flight 358, bound for Toronto.
Far aisle, left-hand side. Merci.
Philippe Lacaille is traveling with his wife and 2 of his 4 children.
Would you like the windows?
They're stuck at the back of the enormous jet, and they're not sitting together.
It just happened that we were separated from Emily. They had 3 seats together, so we were in the middle section, and Emily was actually sitting a couple of seats ahead of us on the right side, so close to the right wing of the plane.
For Eddie Ho, Flight 358 is the continuation of a trip that began in Johannesburg.
I'm an international student in Canada at Queen's University, and every summer I go back to South Africa.
Ho isn't traveling light.
I was carrying everything that I had, my books to my clothing to tuition money for the year, computer laptops.
This is also another leg in a long journey for Joanne Cordery Bundock, who's returning from a trip to Thailand.
I rerouted myself in the last 2 days before the flight from Bangkok through Paris to come directly to Toronto.
As the passengers continue to board, the flight crew gets settled into the Airbus A340. The captain is 57-year-old Alain Rosaille. He's been with Air France for more than 20 years. His co-pilot is 43-year-old Frédéric No.
Do you want to start, or should I?
Why don't you fly first, and then I'll take over for landing in Toronto. I check the weather.
On this flight, the 2 men decide that Captain Rosaille will handle the takeoff in Paris, and co-pilot No will land in Toronto.
Destination, Toronto Pearson.
Check. Crews often split the duties so that co-pilots can get more experience. Rosaille and No are joined by one other person in the cockpit.
I think you've been expecting me. I'm Miles Trochassé. Welcome.
Miles Trochassé is the son of an Air France employee. He's allowed to ride in the cockpit's jump seat for free.
I just want to let you know I've done this before. I promise I'll be quiet.
This Air France plane is one of the safest in the world. Since the A340s first went into service in 1993, they've had an excellent safety record.
Air France 358. Air France 358, runway 27 left. Cleared for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff. Air France 358. Have a good afternoon, gentlemen.
Just a few minutes before 2 in the afternoon, Flight 358 powers into the sky above Paris. Toronto may be several thousand kilometers away, but the friends and family of those on board Flight 358 are already making plans to meet the plane when it arrives.
Hello? Audrey, I won't forget. I'll make sure to pick up Mom and Dad. No, I won't forget the 2 brats either. I'll get them all.
Well, we usually make arrangements before we go to France to be picked up. It's easier because we have lots of luggage, you know, and we bring back stuff from France. So it just happened that Julian, our son, was going to spend the summer in Toronto and was available to pick us up.
Sis, I'll give you a call as soon as I get in. Don't worry. I got it covered. Okay? All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Center, we have a humidex advisory and extreme heat alert for Toronto, as well as a thunderstorm warning in effect for Toronto.
A regular flight from Paris to Toronto takes about 8 hours. As Air France 358 closes in on Canada, there's little to separate this trip from any other.
I found that their service was amazing. The food was great. They had very good flight attendants.
There were a lot of exchange students from France, you know, like teenagers, you know, coming to Canada for their first time, usually their first flight, and they were very rowdy.
There was a beautiful day on the flight over, and the sun was shining, and it was just blue skies and white clouds, and just a lovely day.
The autopilot does most of the work for Captain Alain Rosaille and his co-pilot Frédéric No. Just as the two men had planned, No is now in control of the plane.
We have a new weather report.
The two men get regular updates on the weather conditions in Toronto.
Overcast and rainy with a chance of thunderstorms. Temperature in the low 20s.
At Toronto's International Airport, the thunderstorms are already rolling through. Rain, wind, and lightning are hammering the runways. The lightning has already forced airport authorities to declare a red alert. It means that the chance of being struck by lightning is so great that ground crews are not allowed to work on the planes. Just as Flight 358 closes in on Toronto, it's put into a holding pattern. The weather isn't getting any better.
There's going to be a little delay.
Air France 358, so roger on delay.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm sorry to inform you that there'll be a short delay. There's some weather conditions above Toronto, and we're just going to give it a couple of minutes to clear up.
I was very surprised when I heard the captain's announcement that we were going to be delayed in landing for about 25 or 30 minutes because of thunderstorms over Toronto.
While they're not in the storm yet, the crew enters their holding pattern northeast of Toronto. Their alternate airport is almost 300 kilometers away in Ottawa. At the moment, the plane has a little over 7,500 kilograms of fuel in its tanks, more than enough to get them there.
Typically, a pilot will think about the economic impact of diverting to an alternate airport. While that is not a primary decision maker, it is an alternate decision maker as far as if they have to divert, how are the folks going to be transported from that alternate airport back to the destination airport that the airplane was originally going to.
Flying almost 300 passengers to Ottawa would be a logistical nightmare. But the crew can't circle for too long with the fuel they have. If the delay continues, they'll have no choice but to divert.
Air France, Toronto arrival. Your hold is now canceled. You are cleared for a Wasi 2 arrival. Maintain 5,000 feet.
Air France 358, roger on cancellation of hold. Cleared for Wasi 2 arrival and maintain...
Today, the delay isn't long at all. Although the storm continues to thunder down near the airport, the crew is put into their landing sequence.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Just wanted to let you know we're beginning our descent into Toronto at this time. We should be on the ground at about 4 p.m. local time.
Usually when they say 45 minutes, you know, it's to be nice. You know, usually it's like an hour and a half. This time it was like 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, they said, okay, well, now we're going to go down, prepare, for the landing.
With co-pilot Frédéric No at the controls, the plane begins its descent into the storm.
Air France 358, reducing speed to 190.
No isn't prepared for what he's about to face. The storm has a savage surprise in store for everyone on board Flight 358. A brutal summer storm is battering Toronto. Winds and lightning are hammering the airport, making it tense for incoming planes. After a short hold, Air France Flight 358, with 297 passengers aboard, begins descending into the storm.
Flaps 2.
Flaps 2. F-speed.
Gear down.
Landing gear down. Spoilers armed. 4 green.
Landing gear down. Spoilers armed. 4 green.
You'll be fine. Don't worry.
It immediately turned into very dark skies and dark clouds and a little bit bumpy and choppy, and the weather outside was definitely within a thunderstorm. But really and truly, to me, it was just a typical stormy landing. Nothing out of the ordinary.
In the main cabin, though, not everyone is so sure.
The plane was getting very bumpy. There was a lot of turbulence. We were surrounded basically by heavy weather, and this was completely not expected. I didn't expect that.
Air France 358, slow your final approach speed.
Air France 358.
Co-pilot Frédéric No has the plane in position. He's moments from landing.
Air France 358, roger.
Flaps to full.
Flaps full.
It was going darker and darker. We were like in the middle of hundreds and hundreds of lightnings. Like every second we had lightnings all around us. So people were getting nervous, quite nervous. I was getting nervous.
Ahead of the Air France Airbus, 2 other planes have just touched down on the same runway that Flight 358 is heading for.
Air France 358, this is Toronto Tower.
Toronto Tower, Air France 358, go ahead.
You are cleared to land runway 24 left. Be advised, the preceding aircraft reports braking action is poor, and they estimate the surface winds near the runway as 290 degrees at 15 to 20 knots.
Braking poor, 15 knots, gust to 20. France 358, thank you.
The crew is being sent to runway 24 left, which will allow them to land into the wind. It also happens to be the closest runway to the city's biggest freeway, which is gearing up to handle the evening rush hour traffic. Facing unpredictable winds and a wet runway, the crew prepare for the landing.
Select auto brakes to medium.
Medium is set.
The final approach for landing was hellish. Lightnings were all over. Turbulences were enormous. You could feel the pilot fight with the plane to keep the plane in line with the runway to land, and they had a heck of a time to keep it lined up. I know my son next to me was getting very nervous, and I was nervous to see my daughter actually far from us.
I cinched up my seatbelt tighter than it was, expecting a very hard landing, and the pilot was going to stick it on the runway, or we were maybe going to do a touch and go, and he was going to give it power and go around, because I knew that it was not going to be just a normal landing.
Landing, autopilot, auto thrust off.
At 2 minutes after 4 o'clock, Air France Flight 358 roars over the beginning of the runway.
Put it down!
This landing was more intense and harder than any time I've ever landed in another aircraft.
It's a very difficult landing. And everyone started clapping, and even the lady who sitting next to me, I remember very clearly, she said, you know, wow, that was an amazing landing. And as soon as she finished that sentence, then all hell broke loose.
We started the plane started violently going up and down, and it felt like we were going 100 miles an hour down a road filled with potholes that were about 3 feet deep.
Immediately you could see this orange aura, and for me it's a picture I will never forget. My daughter was sitting ahead of us on the right side of the plane. And at that time, she turned her head towards us, you know, with very wide eyes, you know, looking at us. And her face was surrounded by this enormous aura, orange aura of fire.
Then, moments after touching down, still traveling at 146 kilometers per hour, Flight 358 runs out of room.
At that point that I believed that we were all going to die. It was obvious that no one can survive this kind of thing.
I thought this was it.
The next thing that I can remember is that an announcement came. Ladies and gentlemen, everything's okay. We've stopped now. Well, no kidding. Of course we've stopped now. But I could tell that everything was not okay because I could immediately smell jet fuel.
As the smell of jet fuel fills the cabin, panic quickly spreads.
Everybody was expecting the plane to blow up. It was obvious.
Smoke and flames are spreading quickly. Now it's a desperate struggle to escape.
You hear shouting from the back that there was a fire, and then people started really getting panicked.
If they don't get out, they have just seconds to live.
We know that about 2 minutes into a fire, in many cases, the environment becomes untenable. So 90 seconds is a good rule that we use in trying to get people out to make sure that they have as much time and safety as possible.
297 passengers are desperate to leave the plane.
The only thing that matters to me now is to get my daughter Emily, who's sitting like 2 seats ahead of me, get her onto me, and protect her as we blow up.
Am I going to try to get my luggage, my laptop? And then I thought to myself, what if I would die trying to get my laptop? I just said, okay, I've got to get out. I've got to get out.
Flight 358 has 8 possible emergency exits, but seconds after the crash, most of them aren't opened.
people were crawling over the seats, they were pushing each other, they were just basically all for yourself.
Hey, stay calm, please. Please stay calm. Be all right.
Open the door! Open the door!
And I could see the air attendant there struggling with the fact that should I or should I not open this door, because the fire was raging just in front of it.
If the fuel tanks rupture and we have a lot of fuel that gets out either onto the ground, well then there's enough heat and fire there that would cause the airplane skin to melt in a couple minutes.
At the front of the plane, thick smoke is pouring in through one of the open doors. Joanne Cordery-Bundock races to the other side of the plane.
The gentleman in front of me had his bag with him, and he was kind of fumbling around with that and trying to take that down the slide. He was a rather large man, and the slide did not deploy the entire way, so I kind of bailed off the side above him and hit the ground.
Eddie Ho has found an exit too, but there's no slide.
And people pushing me forward, I couldn't even control myself. And I was like, I don't want to jump as well because, it was 5 meters down at least.
Is he okay? Is he okay?
In the cockpit, Captain Rosai has been badly injured when his seat was ripped off the floor by the force of the crash. As precious seconds tick by, the flight attendant near the lacailles manages to open the exit door. Even though passengers are confronted with the flames and smoke of the burning engine, they jump out of the plane.
So push them down, my wife went down, I went down. We just ran up as fast as we could through torn metal and thorns and through whatever was left of the ground where the plane was.
Once the fire gets inside the airplane, all of the furnishings are much like the furnishings in your house, and there are foams and materials that, when they catch on fire, produce toxic gases, and that's really the most important lethal aspect of the fire.
Basically, you just had to jump. So what I did was, I prayed quickly and I closed my eyes and jumped.
Emergency workers are able to reach the burning jet just 52 seconds after it crashes. But with the threat of an explosion, it's dangerous to get too close.
It was very difficult to see anything due to the rain that was coming down. There was a lot of smoke engulfing the plane, some fire that was still ongoing, as well as you could see that some of the parts of the plane had broken off, some of the wheels that were at the side of the roadway, as well as portions of the plane's wings that had broken off.
Philippe Lacaille and his family struggle up the hill the plane has just plowed down.
And at that point, the plane blew up. Once, twice, 3 times. So you could feel and hear this enormous explosion actually taking place. On the first one, I looked at the first one because I just couldn't believe my eyes. I could see, I think, pieces of luggage, things flying up in the air. And of course, at that time, I figured, oh my God, that could have been us.
We had a perfect view of the airplane and see this black smoke coming out the side of the airplane, and the yellow and the orange and the red flames shooting out. We were fine, but we just knew that there were so many passengers in that plane that had not gotten out.
August the 2nd, 2005. Air France Flight 358 has crashed off its runway in Toronto. Flames are tearing at the fuselage. Smoke is pouring from the ruined jet. Dazed passengers are stumbling from the plane.
Passengers that were coming up, again, were very rain-soaked and muddy from coming up the hill. There were several individuals that once they got up there were crying and a bit emotional, as well as looking around for other passengers or family or friends that may have been with them at the time.
About 35 minutes ago, a plane ran off the runway at Toronto's Pearson Airport.
Footage of the crash quickly appears on local TV stations. Philippe Lacaille's daughter Audrey is one of the many people shocked by the pictures.
She turned on her TV, and here we go. There was the Air France crash right here, live in front of her, you know, burning, exploding right in front of her eyes.
250 people on board. We have not had any reason to make a statement yet as to whether anybody has survived or escaped.
Philippe Lacaille's son Julien is waiting for his father at the airport. He has no idea what's just happened to the Air France flight.
What? What do you mean, where am I? I'm at the airport waiting for mom and dad. Like, you... What?
So Julian didn't know anything, and he was there at the airport. And she says, well, you know what? I think you're going to have to wait a long time because the airplane just crashed.
One of the busiest highways in North America borders the airport. Just before rush hour, it's packed with thousands of vehicles. Drivers slow down, captivated by the terrifying sight of the burning plane. Some of the passengers who've escaped the plane stumble, dazed and shaken, right onto the edge of the highway. Passing motorists stop to take them to the airport.
At this point, there was only about 25 or 30 people with me in the airport. And here, you're also beginning to think, is this all there is?
As people are brought in, airport employees struggle to account for all the passengers and crew.
They were totally disorganized. There's no announcements being made. There's nothing of any kind of organization, and you're in this little crowded area with all the irate passengers waiting to be processed. Some people even said, you know, the first disaster was the plane crash, and the second disaster is exactly how it was handled afterwards.
Relatives wait desperately for any news. Julien Lacaille is just one of many who fears the worst.
For at least an hour and a half, he thought we were dead. That's a shame because, of course, we panicked, we were scared to death, but the families that were waiting for the passengers, they were even more scared because it lasted much longer. They really believed deep down that their family members were dead.
Finally, hours after the crash, passengers who have waiting family members are reunited.
Julian! Julian! What's up? Oh, you okay? Oh, we're okay. How did you...
We finally met up with Julian. It was 11 o'clock at night. It was, you know, God, we're so lucky. We're so lucky. We're alive, you know? It's hard to explain, but it's like you're giving a second chance, you know? Here's my son, you know. Maybe I didn't tell him I loved him, you know, when I left for France. Now it's time to say it right away. It was a very nice moment. A very, very deep moment.
It's just one of dozens of reunions. It takes hours to confirm, but by early evening, Air France and the local airport authorities can make the incredible announcement. Remarkably, every single passenger and all the members of the crew of Flight 358 have managed to escape the burning wreckage of their plane. The next day, smoke and charred wreckage are all that remain of Air France Flight 358. The Airbus A340 is a sophisticated, highly engineered plane with a glowing safety record. What had gone so terribly wrong? Canada's Transportation Safety Board quickly begins investigating the accident.
Landing, autopilot, auto thrust off.
Rain and lightning had been battling the airport all afternoon. Was it simply bad weather that caused this crash?
Put it down! Put it down!
Neither the pilot nor the co-pilot have spoken publicly about the crash.
We have to evacuate now!
Citing lawsuits that were filed soon after, Air France has kept all of its employees who were on the plane from speaking to the media.
Is he okay?
I don't know.
Is he okay?
I don't know.
But former Air France trainer Hervé Labarthe has spoken to Captain Rosaille.
We spoke, let me think, for half an hour. He told me that this is the crucial point, that he has control. More specifically, informed control that he had reached the point where he would have to consider diverting. What he told me is that control informed him that they would soon open the runway. There was, of course, a lot of lightning, rain and turbulence can have a devastating effect. Instruments become more difficult to read, the aircraft is harder to handle.
Investigators discover that as the crew struggled for control in the cockpit, on the ground, delicate instruments used to measure the wind of the runway were destroyed by lightning. With the ground equipment destroyed, they were relying on their onboard systems for information about wind conditions.
The onboard equipment only gives them the actual wind direction and speed on the nose of the aircraft at that exact time. It does not predict ahead of the aircraft. So the pilots really have no way of knowing what lies ahead of them.
But two planes had touched down just minutes before the Air France flight on the same runway. The crews of those planes did their best to inform air traffic control of the tricky conditions.
Air France 358, this is Toronto Tower.
Toronto Tower, Air France 358, go ahead.
You are cleared to land runway 24 left. Be advised, preceding aircraft reports braking action is poor, and they estimate the surface winds near the runway as 290 degrees at 15 to 20 knots.
Braking poor, 15 knots.
20-knot winds are strong, but are well within the allowable range for landing an A340. But when investigators study radar images of the airport, they discover quite a different story. As Flight 358 landed, a sharp line of rain moved across the runway from north to south. It was driven by a sudden gust of wind of up to 33 knots. The crew of the Air France jet had to deal with conditions that were much worse than they were expecting.
Landing, autopilot, auto thrust off.
33 knots is the demonstrated maximum crosswind for an A340, and that would be on a dry runway. So when you say 33 knots at 90 degrees, you're encroaching on the limits of the aircraft.
Closely studying the airport, investigators uncover another piece of the puzzle. Maintenance issues and the storm itself were forcing air traffic controllers to use runway 24 left for landings. It's the shortest runway at the airport, almost 650 meters shorter than some of the others. Blinded by rain, driven by unexpected winds, and landing on the shortest runway at the airport, Flight 358 was in a dangerous position.
Over the previous 4 hours, they had been made aware of the terrible storms and red alerts. And that was for me my biggest concern. Were they perhaps overtired? Were they lax, victims of routine? In any case, it's obvious that they hadn't gauged the extent of the danger.
It's evident that the flight crew didn't perceive the information that they were getting from these various sources as being threatening. Therefore, they attempted to make a landing.
But even in bad conditions, even on a short runway, the crew had 3,000 meters in which to land their plane. It should have been enough. To find out why it wasn't, investigators turned to the past. In 1999, an eerily similar accident took place in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Damn, we're off course. Oh, I can't see it. Way off.
Struggling with unpredictable weather, the crew of an American Airlines jet landed their plane, only to have it skid off the runway. 11 people were killed. Greg Feith helped investigate that crash.
One of the first things that I thought about was déjà vu. Having the first bits of information about the Air France accident, it reminded me so much of the American Airlines accident.
In the Little Rock crash, Feith discovered that the crew had made a critical mistake, which contributed significantly to the accident.
They hadn't followed all of the checklist procedures, and they didn't have the ground spoilers armed, which basically degrades the efficiency of lift on the wing and settles the airplane heavily on the main wheels so that braking action is more effective.
Spoilers are only one of several ways pilots of passenger jets stop their massive planes. Reverse thrusters are used to redirect the engine power forward as the plane lands, and sophisticated brakes help slow the jets down. To rule out any mechanical fault, all 3 systems are examined by investigators of the Air France crash. One of the brakes on Flight 358 was destroyed in the fire, but the 7 other sets of brakes are all tested after the accident. All of them are working properly.
Flaps 2. Flaps 2. F-speed.
Investigators in Toronto also discover that, unlike in the Little Rock crash, this time the spoilers had deployed properly.
Landing gear down, spoilers armed, 4 green.
And when the engines are examined, the reverse thrusters are deployed. No obvious mechanical fault can be found. As the investigation continues, a French newspaper prints a bombshell. Le Figaro publishes a story claiming that the thrust reversers, which use the jet's engines to slow it down, were not turned on until the plane had been on the runway for more than 12 seconds.
As for Captain Rosay, he confirmed the newspaper report. His explanation was that his co-pilot had tense-stopped and was having difficulty controlling the lateral movement of the plane. No doubt because of the strong crosswinds and because the runway was so slippery, his hand was clamped tightly on the throttle release lever, which prevented the captain from reaching it himself. So the reverse thrusters could not be activated.
Shortly after the newspaper story appears, investigators publish their initial report. It confirms Le Figaro's version of events. Canada's Transportation Safety Board reveals that while the thrusters were found in the on position at the crash site, they had not been deployed as soon as the plane landed. In fact, it took 17 seconds before they reached maximum power.
The delay was a question raised in the report, and I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to why there was such a delay or what was the cause of it. I just know that pilots, as a rule, want to get those reversers in as quickly as possible for maximum stopping.
The investigators reveal other confusing facts about the last few seconds of Flight 358. When it came over the start of the runway, it was twice as high as it should have been. And when it did land, it was nearly halfway down the runway.
Put it down! Put it down!
In these stormy conditions, the crew didn't have enough time to stop.
Once they found that the airplane had floated down the runway, the pilot has to make the decision whether we stay on the ground and try to salvage this bad situation, or we abort the landing, power up, pull up, and go around, get our stuff together, and then come back for a second landing.
Air France 358.
But decisions in a cockpit are joint decisions. The captain and the first officer work together.
If the captain sees that landing will be difficult, he must open throttle and go through abort landing procedures. That's his duty. And of course, the co-pilot is also allowed to be the first to act. But the captain's duty is to avoid at all costs a lengthy touchdown. That is clear.
Pour ne pas laisser se dérouler un atterrissage trop long, ça c'est clair.
By the time the plane touched down, it had only 1,500 meters to stop. And when it did land, critical seconds were lost when the reverse thrusters weren't engaged.
Est-ce que l'action des reverses immédiate
Would it have made a difference to immediately activate the reverse thrusters? Of course it would. Since reverse function reaches its peak efficiency at high speed, that is the exact moment of touchdown, that's what reverse is there for. It's all a matter of aerodynamic braking. The other problem is that the wheels touched ground in the middle of the runway, and reverse or no reverse, at that point it was already too late, as was pointed out by the head of the inquiry. That being said, if the reverse thrusters had been activated immediately, the plane would have come to a stop more quickly.
Il serait sorti moins et moins vite.
In heavy storms, the margin for error is razor thin. On this rain-filled afternoon, sudden wind, a long landing, and a short runway sealed the fate of everyone on board Flight 358. What concerns some in the aviation industry isn't this particular flight, but the reality that overruns are far too common. They happen all around the world, and safety procedures that could stop them are not in place. In August 2005, Air France Flight 358 crashed off the end of a runway in Toronto. It was a horrifying incident, yet amazingly everyone survived. But Flight 358 wasn't the only jet to go off the end of a runway in 2005. Worldwide, there were 37 other runway overruns. And the causes of all these accidents were remarkably similar.
There are a number of causal factors that occur again and again in runway overrun accidents. The weather conditions, the state of the runway surface. It can be wet, it can be icy, it can have snow on it. Speed in excess of a normal approach speed for the aircraft that does not then bleed off as the aircraft attempts to land. And these factors occur again and again in runway overrun accidents.
Unlike the crash at Toronto, some overruns are deadly. This Southwest Airlines flight in Chicago slid off its runway several months after the Air France crash. A small child was killed in a car that was driving on the nearby highway.
Many older airports, in particular in big cities which have expanded out towards the airport in the course of their growth, are constrained in the area that they can use for overruns.
You have to consider what happens when the runway is contaminated. Snow, ice, standing water. That will degrade the stopping performance of the airplane. Add to that a tailwind component, which was existent at the time that Air France landed. That, in combination with the contaminated runway, can jeopardize the landing performance and in fact increase it probably by 50%.
The International Civil Aviation Organization recommends that every airport have a 300-meter safety zone at the end of runways that handle international flights. Canadian standards are a little less strict. They call for a 60-meter overrun area and recommend another 90 meters on top of that. Runway 24 left meets the low end of those recommendations.
There was another runway overrun accident to the runway in Toronto, which was very closely aligned with the runway that is there at the moment, in 1978, when a DC-9, an Air Canada DC-9, rejected a takeoff and ran into the ravine.
Well, the plane started to brake, and then there was just nothing, and then we dropped over the edge. There was about a 50-foot drop, I guess, at the end of the runway. We just went over the top, and then there was a heck of a bang, and people and seats all over the place.
2 people died in the 1978 accident. A coroner's inquest after the crash recommended that the gully be filled in, but it never was.
It's a steep ravine. It has about a 50-foot drop-off, and when you take a large, complicated and fragile piece of machinery, like a commercial aircraft, and you drop it 50 feet, then it tends to break.
There is a possible solution to runway overruns. but it's not being used in Toronto or many other international airports. It's called EMAS, or Engineered Material Arresting Systems.
It's a form of artificial stone or artificial gravel, which has a certain depth. And anybody who's ridden a bicycle into a gravel pit knows that a bicycle stops very quickly and it can be almost impossible to pedal it out. And the same thing happens to airplanes.
Several airports in the US use the system, but most international airports do not.
It's very much more effective than friction braking, and it's certainly incomparably more effective than thrust reverse and spoilers. And any one of these systems, when properly engineered, can stop a large airplane, no matter what the runway surface conditions, in a very short distance.
We have to evacuate now!
But one vital air safety guideline was met when Flight 358 crashed. In spite of the smoke and the spreading fire, the crew of the crippled plane made sure that all the passengers escaped in just 90 seconds.
It's just a miracle that all of those people were able to evacuate the airplane as quickly as they did before the airplane was consumed.
The Air France flight was particularly noteworthy in that everybody got out, essentially unscathed. I know there were some injuries, but everyone got out. So I think it was noteworthy, and it was very good evacuation from that perspective.
Captain Alain Rosaille may never fly for Air France again. His injuries required extensive physical therapy after the crash. At the time, he was less than 3 years from retirement.
Every morning, Captain Rosaille relives the experience, coming face to face with the flames, the noise, the crash. And it made him sad to end his career on that note, having destroyed his plane. That's the worst possible fate for a pilot, the worst outcome.
The co-pilot, Frédéric No, is suspended for 3 months after the accident. By early the next year, he's back on duty with Air France. There are reports that after he helped Captain Rosaille out of the cockpit, he was the last person off the plane. The passengers deal with the crash in their own ways.
Well, I went through nightmares almost every single night, flashbacks during the day. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I questioned myself, why am I here? It's frightening, to be in such a state. And it has taught me to be strong.
We really need to take seriously those safety commands and evacuation information, because you never know. It was a perfect flight. There's not any indications that anything can go wrong, and it's right at the very last second that everything happens. So thank goodness I'm here to be able to talk about it now.
Open the door! Open the door!
There's a lot of negative in the accident, and there's a lot of positive. The negative is, oh my God, I'm gonna die. Oh my God, it's horrible. Oh, I have these nightmares, and yes, I'm traumatized, and my kids are traumatized. However, you have the positives, and the positives are, gee, I'm alive. I have been given a second chance. I have been given a second life. And all of us, my wife and my children and myself, we all experience the same positive effects of the crash, which is we have to give back. We have to do something for others. We have to extend our heart out, our compassion to people who need it. It's almost therapeutic for us, The more you do for others, the better you're gonna feel. So for me, I figured, if I can extend my heart out to others, maybe it's gonna help me as well.
A crowded 747 has disappeared over the Atlantic.
Air India's not showing up.
Pieces are found scattered on the ocean surface. But the vital clues are deeper than any air crash investigation has ever gone.
In this accident, we had nothing.
It was just mind-boggling.
An international recovery effort goes to the very bottom of the sea to rebuild the shattered plane. What they discover will send shockwaves around the world. Early morning, June the 23rd, 1985. A 747 flies across the Atlantic Ocean, 9.5 kilometers above the water. The jumbo jet is nicknamed Kanishka, after an Indian emperor. And Air India promises passengers it will be a palace in the sky.
Indian hospitality is something that the culture prides itself on, and you do experience that when you fly Air India. The colors are rich and warm inside. It's your gateway to India.
On its way from Canada, the plane is heading to London, England, before continuing on to New Delhi. It's been in the air for 4.5 hours. Captain Hansay Narendra is a veteran Air India pilot. Satwinder Binder is a captain too, who's serving as first officer on the flight. As the plane nears land, Binder talks with the flight's purser.
Yes, sir?
Inshaw, do me a small favor. At the back of the plane, seat 54, a boy is sitting there. He just wanted to have a look in the cockpit.
Can I send him now?
After about 15 to 20 minutes.
There are 329 people on board, including passengers and crew. Many of them are flying to India to visit family or friends. Vishnu Pada is traveling to India with his 2 daughters. Their mother, Lata, is already waiting for them there.
We had decided that it would be the ideal year to take an extended vacation in India as a family.
6 minutes after 8 in the morning, co-pilot Binder makes radio contact with air traffic control in Ireland.
Shanwick, Air India 182, good morning.
Station calling Shannon. Go ahead again, please.
Thomas Lane and Michael Quinn are working at the Shannon Control Center.
Air India 182 is 51 north, 15 west at level 310. Estimate FIR at 0735.
Air India 182, Shannon, roger. Cleared for London, flight level 310.
Air India 182 is cleared to London, maintain 310.
You want to come up front now?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go.
It's a light morning at Shannon Control. They're dealing with just 3 planes. But something peculiar has happened.
The signals are all jumbled up.
The signals on radar merged so that it was totally impossible to read the call signs and flight levels of any of the 3 aircraft.
The Air India 747 is flying at 31,000 feet. A TWA jet is several thousand feet above it, and a CP flight is 2,000 feet higher. All are traveling east. Because the planes are stacked on top of each other, the signals have merged on the controller's two-dimensional screen.
Tom moved the tracker ball on radar and separated the signals.
Two of the planes reappear on the radar, but the Air India flight has vanished.
Air India's not showing up.
Hold on a minute. Air India 182, do you read?
Air India 182, this is Shannon, do you read? Over.
It's 8:14 in the morning.
I had a gut feeling. To this day, I don't know why I picked up the phone.
Yes, it's Michael Quinn at Shannon. We have a plane off radar.
Normally, a distress call to search and rescue isn't made until a plane has been out of contact for more than 20 minutes. The Air India flight has been missing less than 60 seconds. Several ships in the area begin searching for signs of the plane. Its last known position is some 290 kilometers southwest of Cork. Just 2 hours after the plane disappears, a Canadian-owned cargo ship in the area confirms the worst. The first pieces of wreckage are discovered. Uninflated life rafts are spotted bobbing in the cold Atlantic. Then bodies are seen. It's quickly clear that no one has survived. In India, Lata Pada is waiting for her husband and 2 children to arrive when she hears the news from her brother.
He sat me down and told me that, something terrible had happened. I was just in total shock, and, part of me was trying to digest the information, and part of me was trying to imagine if indeed the worst had happened, how I was going to continue my life without them.
Dozens of bodies arrive in Cork. Many more will follow. Now investigators are faced with the enormous task of finding out how they died and what had caused the crash of Air India Flight 182. "130,000 people live in the city of Cork. Tucked into the southern coast of Ireland, it's long been a vital seaport. On June the 23rd, 1985, a gruesome cargo begins arriving at the city's docks. Just hours after Air India Flight 182 crashes into the sea, bodies and wreckage are brought in by boat. Dr. Cumin Doyle is a pathologist at the Cork Regional Hospital.
The first bodies arrived at 4:45 p.m. on that Sunday afternoon, and at 12 midnight we had 130 bodies.
Doyle and his team will examine the bodies to see if they can find any signs of what caused the crash.
It's an enormous undertaking for everybody involved, the hospital personnel, the police, the Navy, the Army, and pathologists like ourselves, but we just had to get on and do the job.
There are so many autopsies to perform that Doyle moves the work into the building's gym.
We had 3 police people working on each body, photographer, a ballistics expert, and a forensic odontologist. That is a person who examines the teeth, the face, for identification purposes.
In just 4 days, autopsies are performed on 132 victims.
All parts of the body were examined externally in detail, and every detail was noted down. We were looking, of course, for the causes of the fatalities.
Doyle makes a telling discovery. Almost all the victims died in the air.
Only 2 of the bodies showed signs of drowning, which indicated that the others were not breathing when they hit the water.
There's something else that's common to many of the victims. A large number have had their clothes torn off.
Now that was important, because if they had no clothes or little clothes, it indicated that they had fallen from 31,000 feet or so where this accident occurred.
Some of the bodies also have signs of so-called flail injuries. These are breaks specific to bones in the hips, shoulders, and other joints. H.S. Kohler is the lead investigator into the Air India disaster. The flail injuries tell him the passengers weren't in the plane when it hit the ocean.
They are caused by tumbling, violent motion of the body in air. And that is the pattern of the injuries when a passenger is thrown out of the aircraft at a high altitude.
The autopsies show that somehow the plane had been ripped apart high above the water. Passengers were thrown into the sky long before the plane crashed.
Based on the injuries, we could only say that the plane had broken up at 31,000 feet. We couldn't say what the cause of the breakup was.
The biggest challenge in this accident was that we had no physical evidence available to us in this accident in terms of wreckage, in terms of passengers, crew, or in terms of eyewitnesses. In this accident, we had nothing.
The most important job of the investigators is to try to find the plane's black boxes. The 2 devices record cockpit conversation and other technical information about the flight of the plane. The recorders have radio beacons which send out a signal at a designated frequency. But it's still a huge task. The boxes are more than 6,500 feet below the surface, and the radio signals last just 30 days. Salim Jiwa is a journalist who has investigated the Air India disaster.
The search for the black boxes was urgent, and 3 countries participated in it: England, Ireland, and India.
But even with such a massive response, early efforts are frustrated.
42 kilohertz. It's too high. It can't be them.
Investigators are picking up radio signals, but they're at the wrong frequency. As the search continues, H.S. Kohler and his team study the maintenance history of the plane. They want to know if an undetected flaw had caused the jet to come apart in flight. They uncover a potentially important piece of information. The Air India jet was flying with 5 engines. A 747 normally has 4 engines, but it can carry more. The plane was designed so that it could transport a malfunctioning engine beneath its wings. Ground crews can mount the engine to a bracket on the plane. It's exactly what happened to the Air India jet.
There was an extra engine that a previous flight had left behind that was mounted on the wing of the aircraft.
The extra engine creates substantial drag on the left side of the plane. If the pilots don't properly compensate, the plane will start turning in that direction.
And this hypothesis continued that there is possibility that this fifth engine might have caused the breakup of the wing.
In fact, investigators discover that before the plane took off for London, the flight engineer noticed problems with the way the engine was attached.
There was a small problem in the fifth engine. I've asked them to fix it up.
All right.
Investigators also learned that some internal parts of the extra engine were taken out and stored in Flight 182's cargo bay. They are so enormous that pieces of the cargo door were removed to make the job easier.
Some of the other parts of the engine went into the rear of the aircraft. Aircraft such as the 747 can handle this quite easily. It's routinely done.
But if the cargo door wasn't reassembled properly, it could have led to an explosive decompression. In 1974, a cargo door blew off a Turkish Airlines flight shortly after it took off from Paris. The sudden decompression crippled the plane. It crashed moments later, killing everyone on board. Kohler must consider two theories. Either problems with the door or with the extra engine itself brought down the plane. If either one had taken place, there should be evidence on the plane's black boxes. Finding the recorders has become increasingly important. Almost 2 weeks after the search begins, investigators get news that helps them pinpoint the location of the black boxes.
The signal will be higher. So this 42 kilohertz could be it. Tell the boats to look again.
The piece of the black box which broadcasts the locator signal is made of ceramic. If it's damaged, the frequency of the signal can change. It means the strange frequency ships detected earlier could be the right one. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder are finally located. But they're so deep, it's difficult to bring them up.
The aircraft was at 6,000 feet below the sea, and it was the depth that was sort of defeating.
A deep-sea submersible is brought in. But even with this specialized vehicle and with the location of the black boxes known, it takes 4 attempts to bring the recorders to the surface.
Estimate FIR at 0735.
Air India 182, Shannon, Roger. Cleared for London.
Lead investigator Kohler now has what he hopes are 2 vital pieces of the puzzle.
If there's any problem in the aircraft, the crew will be talking about the problem. They will not be silent about the problem.
But when he listens to the cockpit voice recorder, Kohler hears nothing unusual. After the last contact with air traffic control in Shannon, the voice recorder picks up the crew talking about customs seals.
To seal the bar before the
It's
arrival.
paperwork that has to be completed before landing.
Have not been used. And they want about 30 custom seals.
Customs?
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
The conversation ends in mid-sentence.
That was it, and then everything was, of course, silent.
The cockpit voice recorder indicated that there was no abnormality in the cockpit, no emergency. Every conversation was normal.
The plane's flight data recorder tells a similar story. Kohler pours through details about Air India's speed, altitude, and dozens of other pieces of information. The extra engine did cause the plane to bank slightly, and the jet's rudder was turned 11 degrees to the right. But this was exactly what the crew needed to do to offset the drag created by the fifth engine.
We found that all parameters of the aircraft altitude, aircraft heading, aircraft bank attitude, roll attitude, autopilot engaged, everything was working normally till the last point.
After analyzing both black boxes, Kohler can't find any evidence that the plane was in trouble before it suddenly disappeared from radar. But the very lack of evidence does suggest something. Both recorders get their power from the plane's engines. Both stopped at exactly 14 minutes and 1 second after 8 in the morning. Since the recorders stopped working at the same time, the problem on the plane had to be catastrophic enough to sever the jet's electronic system before the crew could react.
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
Investigators are becoming convinced that there are only two possible explanations for the crash: a devastating decompression or a bomb. They study the wreckage that's been found floating on the surface of the ocean, but it's just a small percentage of the entire plane. And none of it is helpful to investigators. It offers no clues to explain why the plane crashed.
We knew there was no fire. We knew the aircraft was performing well. Everything was normal. There was no cockpit emergency, no warning. We got elimination of all the things, but we did not got the answer as what happened. To go to the cause of the accident, we had to go to the wreckage which was lying at the bottom of the sea.
But what parts of the plane should investigators focus on? The black boxes were equipped with radio transmitters which made them easier to find. But the debris field is deep underwater and enormous, some 16 kilometers long and 6 kilometers across. How do investigators identify the one clue that will help them unlock the mystery? Roy Truman is an underwater salvage expert. He's brought in to do something that's never been done before: retrieve the ruined pieces of a jumbo jet from the bottom of the ocean. In hundreds of thousands of pieces, he needs to find the ones that will explain why the plane crashed.
Up until that time, we had only been used with recovering small aircraft. Here we're talking about a 747, which was huge, and we had no idea of the size of the pieces and what we were going to find.
Investigators know they can't bring the entire wreck to the surface. It's so deep it takes hours to recover a single piece. The submersible takes underwater video and still photos. Investigators use those to decide which pieces to bring to the surface.
It was a narrow corridor, and at each end of the corridor, it was very light wreckage. All of the heavy stuff, engines, main aircraft structure was in the middle of the wreckage field.
Like searching for a needle in an underwater haystack, investigators hope to discover the cause of the crash in a tangle of ruined metal. But autumn is coming. Soon the weather will turn bad, and they'll have to abandon their search. The key to unlocking the disaster still lies somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. Investigators from India are scouring the ocean floor, trying to find out why Air India Flight 182 fell from the sky. As the work continues in Ireland, there's growing suspicion in Canada that the Air India crash was no accident. As police and investigators sift through the list of passengers on the plane, they find something peculiar. Many of the passengers who were on Air India Flight 182 began their day in Vancouver. They were using another plane to connect to Flight 182. One of the passengers who bought a ticket for that plane never got on.
Well, the passenger, we have never identified him per se, but the ticket identified him as M. Singh. It simply had an initial, but no full name. We believe that name to be was fictitious, and that the person never intended to travel.
While he never boarded the plane, M. Singh did check in.
Next, please. On your way to Toronto?
And I want my bag checked through to Delhi.
Sir, I can't do that. Your reservation is only confirmed to Toronto.
Oh, I am confirmed. This is my ticket.
Jeannie Adams is a ticket agent working for
You are on
Canadian
standby
Pacific.
to Delhi. I can't. Mr. Singh, you are on standby to Delhi. I can't.
But then I have to pick up my bag.
I can't check your bags through to India if you are not confirmed.
But I am indeed confirmed. Wait. I'll get my brother. He'll tell you.
There are as many as 30 people waiting to check
Do
in.
that, sir. Your reservation is only confirmed to
Adams
Toronto.
doesn't have time to wait for the man's brother.
Oh, okay. I'll check it through. But you have to check with Air India when you get to Toronto. Your seat is 10D.
Even though Singh doesn't have a ticket taking him to India, his bag is checked straight through. His luggage is loaded, but no one notices that Singh never boards the plane that leaves Vancouver.
She broke the rules as they were. She should not have allowed that to go through for New Delhi interline. But she was so bullied and so browbeaten by Mr. Singh in front of everybody else that I think to her eternal sadness and heartbreak, she gave in.
Singh's maroon bag didn't raise any concerns when it was loaded in Vancouver. Since the Air India flight was international, when the bag arrived in Toronto, it faced a more strict series of inspections.
This is what it will sound like.
John D'Souza is a security officer for Air India. The day of the flight, he demonstrated a portable explosives detector for baggage handlers in Toronto. Chemicals in a match triggered the device, as would chemicals used in some explosives.
Okay.
The portable device was put to use because the X-ray machine, which normally scans every piece of luggage, had broken down.
The technology, especially the X-ray technology, were very weak, very in their infancy at that time, and it didn't work reliably. And in the case of the Air India episode, the technology went quite badly wrong, which was one of the tragedies of this situation.
As security workers used the portable explosives wand on the bags, everything seemed normal, until they got to the maroon bag. The bag did trigger the device, but the sound it made was very different from the one workers heard during the demonstration. The bag was passed and allowed on board the plane, eventually flying towards England. Over the Atlantic Ocean, carrying M. Singh's bag. An explosion rips through Tokyo's Narita Airport. 2 baggage handlers are killed. 4 people are injured. A bomb has been hidden inside another piece of luggage that came from Vancouver. Luggage that was bound for another Air India jet.
And it was headed for the cargo hold. When it exploded on the ground, once it was put on, the bag was probably just thumped a little bit, and it exploded as the 2 Japanese baggage handlers were putting it on a conveyor belt.
Just as on Flight 182, one of the bags being moved in Tokyo was checked in by a passenger who never boarded the flight.
There was no X-ray machines in use at Vancouver Airport. There was nothing to stop that bag from flying to Tokyo.
There's a disturbing connection between the Tokyo bombing and the Air India flight. The tickets for the men who checked both bags were bought on the same day by the same customer. The single crash of Air India Flight 182 has suddenly become part of a much larger story. With the apparent connection between the two incidents, investigators in Ireland are extremely interested in what police find in Tokyo. Soon after the bombing, forensic experts descend on Japan's Narita airport. There are traces of evidence everywhere.
The Narita bombing was within a confined space. So unlike the Air India Flight 182 situation where we had debris scattered over 9 miles under the ocean and pretty hard to retrieve, we had, in a sense, the good fortune of a contained area where an explosive device went off.
Pieces of metal and circuit boards are embedded in the walls. Explosive residue clings to parts of the container that housed the bomb.
Amazingly, Japanese forensic experts were able to pick out tiny parts and fragments, and all the analysis finally led Japanese police to identify the vehicle that was used to carry the bomb.
Experts even find serial numbers on pieces of the wreckage. Clues that show the bomb was hidden inside a specific stereo tuner made by Sanyo. All 2,000 tuners that were ever made were shipped to a warehouse near Vancouver, British Columbia. From there, they were sent to stores across the region. One of those tuners carried the bomb that exploded at Narita. Police have a difficult task trying to trace the sale of 2,000 tuners. They could have been sold to anyone. Most of the stores that had received the tuner had been sold out for years. But police get a break when they ask about the tuner at a store in Duncan, a tiny town on Vancouver Island. The last unit had been sold just a few weeks ago.
They were able to figure out who bought the stereo tuner which contained the bomb.
Police obtained the same sort of tuner that was used to house the bomb on Air India. They conduct tests to see how big the bomb would have to be to create the sort of damage that was found in Tokyo.
There was a progressive experimentation using dynamite to find out the extent of damage particular strengths of dynamite would cause.
They match the size of the tuner fragments made after each explosion with the fragments that were found at Narita. They discover that just a few sticks of dynamite were likely used in the Tokyo bomb. But could just 4 sticks of dynamite really bring down a jet? Once they discover just how powerful the Narita bomb was, police place it into a fully loaded luggage container. The devastation is enormous.
Any decompression caused by an event, an explosive device in the luggage hole, would be sufficient to cause catastrophic results for that aircraft. You don't need much. 4 sticks of dynamite can do the job.
The cramped quarters of a cargo hold amplify the power of a bomb. Tests conducted at Penn State University show that the shock waves created from a bomb blast don't travel in just one direction, but reverberate inside a luggage container, building on each other, vastly increasing the initial force of the explosion. If a bomb had indeed exploded in the cargo hold of Air India, it would have caused enormous amounts of destruction. It's the sort of damage that should have left its mark on the remains of Flight 182. Investigators have a growing suspicion that this plane was brought down by a bomb, but they still have no proof.
So the investigators were not only looking for something that was broken that might have caused the failure, but they were looking for signs of what caused the explosion, such as burning or solvent stains or possibly shrapnel in seats. It meant a lot tighter scrutiny of every piece of wreckage.
We kept on analyzing each photograph. Is it giving any indication of an explosion? Is it giving any impact damage?
Knowing his time is running out, Kohler selects a few key pieces of the plane to bring to the surface. Bad weather forces him to leave the rest behind. Kohler hopes the bits he does have can prove there was a bomb on board. Each piece that's brought up is carefully mapped to its original position on the jet. One of the most promising sections brought up from the bottom is the floor of the front cargo bay.
When we recovered that item, we found that it had holes which are of a very special nature. Penetration from inside to outside at a very high speed. Curling of the edges of that one. And that was indicative of that perhaps this is the place where the explosion had occurred.
As many as 20 holes are found. In each, the metal is bent outward, like the petals of a flower. These are classic signs of something being blown out from the cargo bay. On the side wall of the cargo bay, investigators find more clues. Additional holes are discovered, like the ones on the floor. These also appear to have been blown out from the cargo hold. A closer study of the ceiling of the cargo bay also indicates that the ribs connecting it to the fuselage were broken by being forced up. Investigators are convinced that the wreckage shows that a bomb had exploded in the forward cargo hold. If the bomb had gone off in the front of the plane, it would explain why the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder cut off so quickly. Like other 747s, the electronics bay on the Air India flight is located below the cockpit. Many of the important electrical systems on the plane run through here. The forward luggage compartment is right beside it.
And so when the bomb went off, the explosion would have taken out the computers completely, and there would have been absolutely dead silence, and that's precisely what happened.
Investigators are convinced that Air India Flight 182 has been destroyed by a bomb. This was no accident. The crash of the passenger jet was a crime.
Nobody thought that such an evil plot of blowing two aircraft simultaneously would occur from Vancouver.
Exhaustive detective work creates a clear picture of what likely happened on board the Air India jet. In Toronto, M. Singh's bag is taken off the Vancouver flight and moved onto the Air India jet. It's put into a luggage container that's eventually placed at the front of the jet, right behind the plane's electronics bay. As the plane sailed over the Atlantic Ocean, the crew had no warning that a bomb was ticking down to disaster.
They want about 30 custom seals.
Customs?
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
When the force of the blast hit the floor of the jet, it pushed it violently upwards. The thin fuselage would have been blown apart. The air pressure inside the plane would have rushed out, tearing passengers from the cabin and fatally crippling the jet.
The debris scattered over 9 miles is an indication of how rapidly and how how fearsome this whole decompression was. But in this instance, the aircraft completely didn't stand a chance of flight. There was no way of continuing flight in this case.
As the jet fell towards the sea, the forces put on the fuselage tore it apart.
It would have a tail torn off and the wings would start breaking. And there's no way of sustaining flight after that. It goes into gyrations. Once it goes into gyrations, there was just massive structural failure.
After months of painstaking work, investigators believe they have unraveled the cause of the Air India crash. They've proven a bomb brought the plane down. It's now up to police to find the bombers. But with so many deaths, and so many more possible if the Narita bomb had exploded in mid-air, there's immediate interest in making passenger jets safer.
This was one of the biggest disasters in the Indian aviation history. And it could have been avoided if the procedures were in place.
As the hunt for the killers continues, extraordinary steps are taken to tighten security and to see if jets can be made to withstand the force of a bomb. It's May 1997. More than 10 years after a terrorist bomb destroyed Air India Flight 182. An out-of-service 747 is about to take part in a remarkable test. 2 bombs are placed in the front cargo bay. 2 more are put in the back.
Well, the Brunningthorpe test was actually intended to prove 5 years worth of research, that we can protect an airplane using hardened luggage containers or hardened liners in the cargo hold.
The plane is also pressurized to simulate the conditions a jet would encounter at cruising altitude.
Pressurization is the key to that kind of experiment. The added energy that you have from the pressurization inside the airplane adds to the damage. You can think of it as a balloon. If you take a pin and you put it in a balloon that's uninflated, you get just a simple hole the size of the pin. However, if you blow that balloon up and you hit it with a pin, it pops catastrophically.
When the bombs are detonated, the result is devastating.
The force of the blast plus the pressure inside the jet just tore the plane apart. And that's the closest we can come to seeing what would have happened to a jet in flight.
The destructive power of bombs on the jets is well known. But what the tests at Bruntingthorpe showed was that relatively simple measures can substantially minimize the damage caused by an explosion. One of the bombs in the rear cargo hold was placed in a normal luggage container. But the bombs in the front cargo hold were different. One was placed in a specialized container strengthened with a material similar to that found in bulletproof vests. The other was put in a normal container, but placed beside walls that had been reinforced with a blast-absorbing liner. When the bombs explode, the front of the plane is virtually untouched.
We had no breach of the airplane skin with the liner or with the hardened luggage containers. But towards the rear of the airplane or the tail, where we didn't have any of the hardened materials, it was a catastrophic failure for the airplane.
The standard luggage container did nothing to minimize the blast. Both the protective lining in the front cargo bay and the hardened luggage container were able to absorb the force of the explosion.
It's only speculation, but would steps like these have saved Air India? Very likely. Would they make the industry safer today? Absolutely.
Despite the dramatic results of the tests in Britain, hardened luggage containers are not used by world's airlines. While effective at stopping bombs, they're extremely expensive.
The hardened containers are not in use now because it's just not economically feasible. The containers cost the tens of thousands of dollars just to purchase, and they're very fragile. They're composite materials, so if you run into the side of them with a forklift, they're pretty much useless from that point forward.
There have been significant improvements made to the way that passenger luggage is screened at most international airports. More sophisticated color X-ray systems using multiple scanning beams are now used.
But I am indeed confirmed. Wait, I'll get my brother. He'll tell you.
Oh, okay. I'll check it through. But you have to check with Air India when you get to Toronto.
And there are stricter regulations about luggage getting sent forward on connecting flights.
In the case of Air India, the most important thing of all was passenger baggage reconciliation. This is the key to detecting an explosive device or a terrorist. No plane leaves with baggage unattached to a specific passenger inside that plane. And that must be so.
Your seat is 10B.
I think one of the most difficult piece of news for the families to accept was the many ways in which this tragedy could have been prevented. I mean, it was absolutely unforgivable that a bag could be interlined to another destination without a passenger accompanying it.
The quality of training that security guards at airports get also came under scrutiny during the years after the Air India crash. It's still an area of concern for some security experts.
There's a real failure to train security personnel. And that failure is because you cannot pay rent-a-cops subsistent wages to look after your security when you get on board an aircraft.
In the Air India case, police eventually traced the bombing to Sikh extremists living in Canada. They're fighting to have an independent Sikh homeland created in India. The man who confessed to assembling the bomb is sent to prison. The man suspected of masterminding the plot is killed several years later while under arrest in India. Both men had deep ties to Canada's West Coast Sikh community. It's a connection that still bothers Lata Pada.
It was a deliberate act of terrorism, and hurts even more that they were executed by Canadians on Canadian soil against Canadians.
More than 20 years after the destruction of the Air India flight, the shock of the day is still fresh. And many questions remain unanswered.
We still don't know who the two people were who checked in the bags. Apart from the basics of who made the bomb, we don't know much about who else assisted them. We don't know who picked up those tickets. There's a vow of silence that has hindered the investigation.
This inquiry will be launched immediately.
In 2006, the Canadian government launched an inquiry into the Air India bombing, another investigation of what happened and why. The shocking death of so many is a continuing source of anger and disbelief. No matter what the inquiry finds, the sobering facts are the same. 329 people killed in an instant. There are memorials now in Ireland and Canada, mourning the victims of the Air India crash. Marking the day a terrorist bomb ripped through the lives of so many.
It's just so tragic about all our lives that we lead. Every day is an ordinary day in our lives, but some days, unexpectedly, something completely, totally unexpected shatters your life, and that was one of those moments.